Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as polling days draws into its final hours, I thought I'd reflect on what are, for me, some of the most in-your-face images and stats on Tory Britain 2024. People can see for themselves, of course. Even those voting Conservative today seem fairly open about the fact the country is in a terrible state. They're just convinced that somehow it would be worse under Labour, and in a few years' time, when it's demonstrably not, they'll come up with some excuses. Oh, actually, that was all what the Tories did. It's paying off now. They told us it would pay off if only people had waited a bit longer. But in the detail that people don't pay attention to, there are some fairly horrific images associated with Tory Britain. But before I get onto that, a word from our glorious Chancellor, the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt, the man who has been in charge of our health and social care, then our foreign affairs, and most recently our entire economy. He's projected to lose his seat, so he's been campaigning pretty hard in his constituency this last few weeks. Do you know what his good news was for his locals yesterday? He tweeted out that people can now drink the tap water. He described it as, quote, brilliant news. Enjoy the tap water, Bramley. He said that. Those are his exact words. Can you imagine a more tragic promotion of Tory Britain from the second most senior member of the government? That drinking tap water, one of, you would think, the bare minimum standards we should expect in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, is for an unknown period, once again, possible without giving yourself the shits. And this should be hailed as a great boon to the locals of Bramley. No, sorry, that, your local infrastructure fell apart. Yeah, we're sorry about that. No, none of that. No apology. No promise that it won't happen again either. No. Glory in the window reopening whereby you can drink water without having to purify it first. It's like North Korea level gaslighting, this. But then an image posted today which reminded me of really what Tory Britain's all about. The food bank is closed for the election. Food banks. Is there a more desperately misunderstood concept as the food bank? A few years ago, when the Tories were about to win the Hartlepool by-election, there was a vox pop, found someone saying, they were used to, but they were going to vote Conservative. They'd used to be voting Labour. They were going to vote Conservative. Why? Because there were no food banks in the town when Labour were in government, and now they were. He saw it as a sign of Tory success, Tory development of his town. As do many others. They think, well, food banks give food to people who need it, so that's a good thing. They never stop to think that food banks actually exist, not to give food to people, but because people are unable to get the food for themselves from the shops. There are a lot of bad things in Tory Britain that people understand are bad. They might make excuses for the Tories, but they know they are bad. If they see NHS waiting lists 4 times higher than under Labour, they know that's bad. Nobody thinks that's a benefit. When house prices as a proportion of incomes are higher, again, they know that's bad. Okay, sure, the people who own their own homes quite like it if they're not intending to sell and upgrade. But from a home buyer's point of view, everyone knows that's a bad thing. Rivers full of pollution. Nobody thinks, oh good, ready source of fertiliser, farmers must be terribly pleased. People aren't that thick. I'm really struggling to think of a metric which is actually so monstrously bad, but you can persuade the gaslit that it's actually good. There are a few net zero type issues where you steer a lot of people are susceptible to the con, but nothing that is as completely 180 degrees as food banks. A food bank literally exists to cover for a problem which should not exist. Like, you will always have an NHS waiting list of some sort. Illnesses and injuries exist. When people get them, you want to treat them, so they go onto a waiting list. So a waiting list is not a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing when it becomes so long that treatment is delayed unnecessarily. But food banks should not exist at all. They should not need to exist. In fact, I'll be discussing at some point the metrics I'm going to be tracking when it comes to monitoring the progress of Labour in government. One of them will definitely be measures like this. You can't do it for the total number of food banks. because as long as they're needed at all, they will exist, even if that need is drastically reduced. But the number of parcels given out, that is going to be an instructive metric. You know, there's a meme that's flown about for a year or so now, I think, which basically has a mock graph which says, oh, every graph in Britain right now, it has the good thing getting better up until 2010 and then crashing, then the bad thing getting lower, a bit of a wobble during the banking crash, then marching upwards after 2010 and then taking off like Speedy Gonzales after 2020. And it's true, that is basically every graph in Britain. Average incomes in real terms are about where they were in 2010. You know, they've gone nowhere and they're still lower than in 2008, as Rishi Sunak was personally making his first fortune by triggering the banking crisis. NHS waiting list, no secret, Labour have been promoting that graph quite a bit. The reason the Conservatives have run such a relentlessly negative campaign is they've got no good news to promote. Oh, except being able to drink tap water in Bramley now with a fair chance of survival. Okay, sorry, I forgot. The cost of everything has increased out of proportion to most people's incomes. You know, as if that weren't bad enough, the Tories decided to completely smash our supply chains to make it even worse. I mean, think on that. David Cameron decided to appease the swivel-eyed loons with Brexit because he thought it would cock-block Nigel Farage and keep the Conservatives from having what would have been their usual minor internal argument. How's that going? Nigel Farage, who was never able to win a parliamentary election when we were inside the EU. Mr. Brexit couldn't win a parliamentary election when we were inside the EU. Now looks set to have his best chance of stinking the House of Commons out with stale tobacco and cheap gin. And Cameron's party is about to implode. Cameron's Brexit strategy will surely go down in history as one of the most self-destructive political acts this country has seen. And just how self-destructive? Easy to suppose I'm referring to the fact they're going to lose the election badly. No, that day would come regardless. Even without Brexit, at some point the Conservatives would of course gone on to lose an election. Maybe it would still have been this year, because the Conservatives have been retreating back to their only safe demographic. They have burned bridges with their own future. The YouGov voting intention poll from a few weeks ago had just 7% of 18 to 24-year-olds intended to vote Conservative, 12% of 25 to 49-year-olds, and 16% of like 50 to 64-year-olds. It'll be interesting to see what the actual stats are when we get the full results. But it's not just that this is a dramatic reduction. It's unsustainable for them. Like, you think about over the next decade, they're going to try and rebuild support, right? They're still screwed. Even if they could double those figures over the next decade, that would still put them on less than a third of voters of these age groups. And actually consider that by the time that decade's over, they're all 10 years older as well. The younger ones coming up aren't voting for them. They haven't lost these people just because of their greed and incompetence. You know, being in opposition, yes, they've lost some people who'll come back to them once they're in opposition again. You know, that's been a big chunk. But the Tories have deliberately moved themselves out of step with the concerns of almost everyone. When David Cameron became leader of the opposition, leader of the Conservative Party, he was still in opposition, he positioned the Conservative Party quite carefully into one that appeared to have respect for the NHS, that took climate change and net zero seriously, that wanted to heal society, not pretend it didn't exist. Remember Hug a Hoodie? Hug a Hoodie? It was all lies. It was a campaigning strategy. It's not what they really felt. It's not what David Cameron really was. But he understood the need to do it. He understood the grift in order to win support. What the Conservatives have now done is they've made a virtue out of attacking any need to prioritise climate change. They're not just attacking the usual marginalised members of society. They've made enemies of like the RNLI and the National Trust. How the hell did that happen? They're attacking the very causes that most voters approve of. They are completely out of step and wanting to march further out of step. It's very hard to see when, if ever, there will be an attempt to realise this, because they will not, just with the passage of time in opposition, naturally gather enough support to have another tilt at a general election. They will certainly not recognise that they have moved so far away from voters while they are laser focused on trying to counter Nigel Farage by becoming Nigel Farage. And the longer they leave it, the more they're screwed, because they've retreated to that core of voters who are quite elderly. So the longer they leave it, the more of those trenchant supporters die off to be replaced by nobody. Because if the image of the food bank use is arguably the worst image of Tory Britain, perhaps the best is that they are at least paying the price. It may not be such a hefty price as they deserve, like being beaten into third place, although I retain some optimism until I see at least an exit poll. But they are not simply going to be able to rebuild like they did last time. Their entire outlook is not only unfit for today's times, it's seen as unfit by people. And the people they're promoting within their own party simply haven't got the critical thinking skills to understand that. They're all about short-term gratification. Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, they just want to be leader. Robert Jenrick, they just want to be leader. They just want to feed their own egos. They've no interest in what's actually necessary to win power. They haven't got that careful thought process within them. And so on that silver lining, I'll leave you to your last few hours to vote. Until then, those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.